All right. So good afternoon and welcome to Friday Forum. My name is Lindsay Realmuto. I'm a third-year PhD student in UIC's Urban Planning and Policy Department. I think there's a lot of PhD students on the webinar today, so I don't think I need to explain what CUPS is. But before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to go over a few points. Today's forum is being recorded and will be available on the CUPS website, along with past Friday Forum events for those who haven't been able to make some of our prior events for this year. And second, please keep yourself muted. I've muted everyone upon entry, but if you could just keep that muted until our speaker has finished their presentation. If you have any questions during their talk, please feel free to put it in the chat box, which I will be monitoring, or just wait until the end. We should have plenty of time, about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sara Jensen Carr, who is an assistant professor of architecture, urbanism, and landscape, and the program director for the Master of Design in Sustainable Urban Environments program at Northeastern University. She is a licensed architect and holds a master's in architecture from Tulane University, where I got my bachelor's degree, by the way.
Oh,
she also has a master's in landscape architecture and a PhD in environmental planning from the University of California, Berkeley. Her work and research on the connections between urban landscape, human health, and social equity has been funded by the Mellon Foundation, the San Francisco Planning and Urban Research, and the National Science Foundation. She has been published in a number of outlets, including Preventative Medicine, LA Plus Journal, Places Journal, and the Journal of Architectural Education. And she's also been interviewed by the New York Times, CNN, and Foreign Policy, among others, for her expertise on epidemics and urban design. So today she will be discussing her book, The Topography of Wellness, How Health and Disease Shapes the American Urban Landscape, which was published by the University of Virginia Press in 2021. So Dr. Carr, the floor is yours, and welcome to Friday Forum.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, and thanks everybody for taking the time to come today. I'm just gonna share my screen and hopefully the right one comes up. Okay, does everybody see my full screen?
Yes.
Yeah, notes. Okay, great. Okay, just want to make sure. Yeah, thanks everybody for taking the time to come today. I don't know what your schedule is. We're right before spring break at Northeastern University, and I'm just sensing a lot of burnout on the part of my students yesterday and maybe myself. So if you're at the same point in the semester, thanks for taking the time today to come. I really appreciate it and hope we can have with this group, you know, just a casual conversation afterwards. But again, thanks so much for inviting me to talk about this this book. You know, maybe like many of you, I'm actually not a historian. I'm trained as an architect and landscape architect, as Lindsay mentioned. I went back to school to get my PhD in environmental planning at Berkeley. But actually, you know, the entire arc of my career, which I'll talk just a little bit about before I get into the book, is this question, and that is, how does the design of buildings, landscapes, and the public realm heal or harm us? So I started to formulate these questions in my head when I was working at an architecture firm in New Orleans after I graduated from Tulane, and I was working on healthcare facilities largely. So I was working there in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit the city. Like many people, I had the privilege of evacuating, and I had even more privilege to come back when many didn't. And so, as I said, I was working for a lot of healthcare and institutional clients at the time, and so my life was really consumed with the recovery for a couple of years afterwards. I was doing FEMA surveys, rehabilitating client buildings, hospitals, but also going to a lot of community planning meetings at the time. And so if we think about what the situation was in New Orleans, I don't know if Lindsay, if we overlap there at all, but we can talk about this after. But you know, a lot of the conversations that were happening there about how to rebuild New Orleans better, right, is what led me to think about, in the absence of hospitals, which is what was happening in the city at that time, there were no hospitals open. We were working to reopen them. We were working to rehabilitate them. What is the power of the landscape in the public realm, and what we're left with, and how is it supportive, or sometimes how is it negative? So that's what led me to go back to school and get my MLA and PhD. And I think, naively at first, I thought very much like in healthcare design, how we use a set of guidelines to kind of guide evidence-based outcomes, and the design of the hospital, right, is very much tied to health outcomes and, healing in a different way. There's some very forward-thinking research on healthcare environments. Not all of it has been integrated, of course, but it was really inspiring to me. And I think I thought, maybe I could come up with guidelines that could apply to the landscape in the same way. But I had already seen at the time how landscape could also be wielded to displace people in the name of well-being and safety. In particular, the kind of like unspecified top-down green space that we often see in vision plans. So for those of you that are not familiar with this is the infamous Green Dot Plan, which was released by the Bring New Orleans Back Commission after Hurricane Katrina. And it kind of widely deemed low-lying areas to be raised for parks. And it was very discomforting for anybody that lived there. To be in New Orleans during the recovery and hear this constant conversation about rebuilding healthier or more sustainable communities, which can sometimes be, I think, a proxy for health as well. And what was implied in that drove me to look for more specific answers, or at least more complicated answers about what that meant. And so that said, I still strongly believe in the power of urban landscapes and addressing health, and the power of urban planning. We have planners here on the call. However, I did want to kind of color it with sort of some skepticism, right, that it's not straightforward. And so in order to better understand how our present day landscape shapes our health, I wanted to look at the history of shifting ideas about both public health and the public realm, and essentially try and construct these parallel histories. The book, which, as Lindsay mentioned, just came out in October 2021. Full disclosure, I've been working on it off and on for about 7 years. It was really a chapter in my dissertation. It started as the literature review in my dissertation. And then in my first academic job, I started to develop it into a book proposal. So since I'm sure most of you are PhD students, I'm happy to talk about that process as well, kind of separate from the book. But as I said, I've been working on it for 7 years, 3 cross-country moves, 3 kids in the interim, only to turn in the finalish manuscript of it in February 2020. And so just actually a few weeks before I turned it in, of course, I was locked down with some small children. It upended our lives, and as I'm sure it did all of yours. Luckily, University of Virginia Press let me have it back through the process, and there were several delays on their end as well due to COVID. And so I was able to address COVID a little bit in the introduction and the conclusion, but I will recognize it was very hard to talk about these things. We're very much in it. So, we can expand this into a larger conversation about COVID, because I have to say I'm still sort of working out my thoughts on it. I'm not a historian. I'm a designer, albeit an academic one, and that's the perspective I came at it from, to think about how the places we inhabit are formed around health. And as I said, even though I've been looking at these topics for a decade now, I'm still trying to wrap my head around, what the COVID-19 pandemic means for myself, what it means for other people, what it means for other perspectives. And so hopefully, the next half hour or so, when I talk about the breadth of the book, and I'm going to very generally go over the periods that are covered in there from the Industrial Revolution to today. I do hope this can find that looking at the history of American epidemics, how these layers got us to the landscape we currently inhabit, and maybe things we can keep in mind in a real inflection point, I think we are in thinking about the built environment and its effect on health. So, the places we live are inextricably tied to our health, although modern day diseases are often a very complicated knot of genetic, lifestyle, and environmental factors. In 2016, Karen DeSalvo, who was then the interim secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, noted that public health had entered a new era. She called it Public Health 3.0, where one's zip code is a better indicator of health than genetic code. And I'm sure many of you have heard that repeated across many different forums. And, you know, it's definitely a statement I wanted to dig into in this book. What I did realize, though, when I was starting to do my literature review, when I was starting to form my dissertation, is I was really interested by this topic of how did we move from the conception of an unhealthy environment being a densely populated urban center to an unhealthy environment being thought of as a car-centric, suburban, and exurban environment decried by many planners and public health researchers, at least pre-pandemic. I don't know where those shifts are going yet. I would love to hear your thoughts too. But we had seen this very notable shift, right? And even in the literature that was coming out at this time. So here in the 60s and 70s, we see 6 cities: the urban crisis, diagnosis, and cure. Even Mike Davis's dead cities. But when I was doing my research, there's a real change in tenure of these books. So now we see happy city, you know, people habitat, making healthy places, building healthy places, put out by the Urban Land Institute. And so there's a very different approach, and especially, you know, thinking that, you know, more dense or maybe mixed density, mixed use, mixed density, walkable environments are really the key to our health. And so I wondered, you know, what happened here? Why did popular opinion shift? And could it be because our health concerns were different as well? So very broadly, I posit in the book that in response to epidemics, we have designed our environments to control, over time, first miasma, then germs, and then behavior. So to start with the miasma theory, Hippocrates on airs, waters, and places connected the health of the environment to the health of those that inhabit it. If you read his writings, he talks about the difference between wholesome and unwholesome waters, the latter being water that is marshy and stagnant, and he talked about people that drank from them as in possession of large and obstructed spleens, hard bellies, yet being emaciated. And although the ingestion of the water was key to his theories, there was also a lot of concentration on the air. And in fact, these were transferred to what we would call miasma theory, which had wide acceptance well into the 20th century. So it associated tangibly foul air and water, like you see in this depiction from Punch magazine, to airborne deadly disease. And so the first movement connecting the built environment to population health correlates with the beginnings of American urban history during the Industrial Revolution. As factories and workforce populations grew in city centers, so did the amount of waste and sewage dumped in the streets. There were slaughterhouses that were often still inside city limits, there was no municipal sanitation, and air pollution was rampant as well. Many housing units lacked indoor plumbing or sufficient light and air, and so there were massive outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and yellow fever, what were deemed filth diseases, which required coordinated action between planners, engineers, public health officials, and doctors. Of particular concern were crowded tenements, and in this cartoon from Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper in 1865, the title was "The Tenement Houses of New York, How the Poor Live in Crowded Cities, How Pestilence is Generated, How Parents are Demoralized and Their Children Depraved, the Great Source of Destitution and Crime." Social scientists who were just beginning to explore the connections between environment and behavior pointed to physical density as a risk factor for what they called moral contagion, as well as disease spread. And cholera became ever more correlated with the generalized urban condition, especially regarding this dense housing. So here we can see cholera depicted as a skeleton, telling the landlord of a tenement specifically that he is about to occupy the premises. And tenements were also routinely described as perpetual fever nests by sanitary inspectors in the surveys done at this time. And so the first big change we see to the American urban landscape in response to health comes from the massive sanitary infrastructure movement that grew out of this crisis. We also saw naturally open waterways, which often served as worker encampments as well as waste conveyance, contained in underground culverts and paved over. Marshlands were filled in not only to get rid of miasmic gases, but as a bonus, it also accommodated industrial expansion. And the outfall of these waste systems were often still in an open water body, but at least it was moved out of the city. Historian Martin Molosi called this the idea that the solution to pollution is dilution. And as long as you could get it out in the ocean and into sort of tidal patterns, it was not worth worrying about anymore. And it's also important to note that this is a shift from miasma theory, and there was a significant body of scientists and doctors that actually did not believe that disease was spread through the air. But the real result of this was a real multi-pronged strategy of personal and municipal sanitation, move to alleviate density, getting light and air into housing, remaking or removing industry and worker housing. And these movements radically remade the haphazard landscape of American cities. Here you can see some pictures from an 1895 edition of Harper's Weekly comparing photos of the same street corners 2 years apart to show what incredible transformation street cleaning had effected. Waste infrastructure really configured the streets of cities. They had to be longer, straighter, and wider to accommodate the pipes. But even thinking about the paving, cobblestones were even thought to hold miasmic filth or air between them. And so they were switched out for smooth pavement that could be washed down at the end of the day. And at the same time, in the remaking of our cities as a formal strategy, many were looking to Europe to see how they had controlled their own cholera epidemics through planning and design. Richard Sennett, in the book Flesh and Stone, talked about how many 18th and 19th century European cities prioritized circulation and movement via their street networks in the wake of physician William Harvey's discoveries about how the heart powered blood circulation. Dirt and grime were thought to clog healthy air throughout the city. Palaces and places of commerce acted as hearts that powered movement, and one-way streets were employed to maintain fast movement and mimic the directionality of veins and arteries. And we see that inspiration probably most clearly in Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago, right, where health comes up as maybe another justification for the larger city beautiful movements. But here we can see, the direct relation to Haussmann's plan, where you have these very wide boulevards that are meant to breathe fresh air through the city, lined with trees to clean the air as well. A parallel movement at this time is, with the streets and sanitary infrastructure transformed, many American cities were looking to parks as a way to breathe fresh air into cities. Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, was actually also served as the executive secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission for some time. And his time there convinced him that density and slum conditions were the root causes of disease, but also that disease was carried through water and the atmosphere. Central Park and many of his other large-scale projects leveraged this fear about the detrimental health effects of diseases to advocate for the health benefits of green space, from providing a mental health respite from the business of the city, and to the supposed filtering effects of trees on quote-unquote bad airs. Today we would call these parks and value them for what we would call ecosystem services, right? And the environmental and health effect of trees, of parks, is very well documented now through empirical research. But in that sense, I think Frederick Law Olmsted was very forward thinking. In a talk called On Public Parks and the Enlargement of Towns that he gave in 1870, he talked about these very things that we have quantified through research today. And he said, air is disinfected by sunlight and foliage. Foliage also acts mechanically to purify the air by screening it. Opportunity and inducement to escape at frequent intervals from the confined and vitiated air of the commercial quarter, and to supply the lungs with air screened and purified by trees, and recently acted upon by sunlight, together with opportunity and inducement to escape from conditions requiring vigilance, wariness, and activity toward other men. And health, and specifically the search for fresh air, was in fact a large driver of the move to Western cities like Phoenix and Denver, which grew significantly by specifically recruiting asthmatics. Dr. Charles Dennison, in a book and pamphlet called Rocky Mountain Health Resorts, talked about Colorado as being the Switzerland of the Americas, so evoking images of clean mountain air, but also implying that people that move there would have the generally accepted superior moral values of Europeans. And this map by Dennison attempts to show the climatic patterns of Colorado, specifically its prevailing dry, cool air. It's estimated that up to a quarter of people who settled in Colorado, Arizona, and California in the late 1800s and very early 1900s did so for their health or a family member's health. By 1890, Denver had grown by almost a third, and there were almost 30,000 people that had moved there to treat consumption. And that rate of growth would persist for the next 3 decades. A lot of these theories, though, and really the relationship between the built environment and health was upended with germ theory, though. Some histories have talked about this as a schism between urban planning and design and health. And, I would, like everything else, I would nuance that a little bit. I don't think it's so much like there was less collaboration between these fields, but we still see the influence of germ theory in a lot of design and planning movements post-germ theory, but they became more metaphorical, and I think therefore were actually more detrimental to the environment. So that said, the commonly accepted ideas of how environment affected health were really upended, especially with the development of vaccines. And while the immediacy of infectious disease had abated somewhat, it did not stop architects and landscape architects and urban planners, as I'll show in a moment, from exploring those ideas. Knowing that the pandemics and epidemics of the early 1900s, namely flu and tuberculosis, could be addressed by medicine, density was no longer the immediate concern. However, many were still thinking about how architecture could optimize bodies and health. And so they were mostly theoretical at this point, and early ideas about miasma were somewhat combined with developing building technology, but also a new fear about the dangers of the street, which were increasingly congested by cars. This is the Radiant City by Swiss architect Le Corbusier, which was conceived of as a vertical garden city. And so the sanitary infrastructure went vertical instead of horizontally in thinking about the cities of the past. Corbusier envisioned all interactions as internal to the building itself. And so the thinking of street as a public realm was really eliminated here. But Corbusier's belief was that he was liberating his building's residents from the filth or grime that was found on the ground. And Corbusier's machines for living were intensely focused on what the right measurements were for an individual in a community made simply by reproducing those units over and over again. In his writings for the Radiant City, Corbusier specified that an ideal apartment would have 14 square meters per occupant. There would be 12 meters of plate glass window to let in the exact amount of sunlight, that the air would be at 64.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and that 8 liters of air were to go through the rooms every minute for what he called exact respiration, that there would be 1,000 people per hectare, but they would not have to walk more than 100 meters to transport, and that could be an elevator or a taxi. And also he specified that each residential unit of 400 by 400 meters would get a swimming pool that was 100 to 150 meters in length. So of course, this very much reflected his personal ideas about health, but I think what we see here was a sort of like quantification of these apartments is a real vaccination-like approach, right, to doling out fresh air and sun and even green space as well. But he believed that the benefits of green space could be just as beneficial if you viewed them from your plate glass window and were looking at green space on the ground. So while Corbusier only has one built work in the United States, which is the Carpenter Center at Harvard, he didn't build any housing, we can still see the influence of his writing and his compatriots in the European consortium SIAM in many public housing units built in the mid-century. However, but without the context of that European social safety net, many of these ideas that were laid out in those documents, such as extreme density to keep green space around buildings, reimagining the corridor as a place of social interaction, and perhaps most of all, the aesthetic disruption and separation from existing context to express modernity actually ended up being detrimental to resident health instead, especially with the lack of maintenance that was put into these buildings after they were constructed. And the mixed metaphors of bodies and cities were also wielded to much more ruinous ends. So at this time, cancer was an epidemic that researchers soon realized could not be conquered by vaccines. In fact, a federally funded study in the early 1960s attempted to inject hundreds of monkeys with human tumors in a desperate effort to point to a cancer germ, but to no avail. In Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor, written in 1977, she confronted the late 20th century era's preoccupation with cancer by comparing it to the previous tuberculosis epidemic, saying, "Now it is cancer's turn to be the disease that doesn't knock before it enters. Cancer that fills the role of an illness experiences a ruthless secret invasion, a role it will keep until one day its etiology becomes as clear and its treatment as effective as those of tuberculosis have become. So the unknowability of cancer is what made it so terrifying, and also made it an apt way to communicate the direness of the urban condition to spur action. The concurrent epidemic of urban blight, which was really an epidemic of disinvestment, disintegration, abandonment, spurred on by racist policies, often leaned on cancer as a metaphor, especially as it appeared to similarly eat cities from the inside out in the form of fire, vice, and crime. Much like cholera before it, in reference to the snow map, which spurred on many of the discoveries about environmental treatment of cholera, blighted properties were documented by public health agencies going from door to door and marking them with black dots, looking for the supposed vectors of contagion of blight. An Architectural Forum magazine from 1951 talked about slum surgery in St. Louis, showing blighted and obsolete districts beginning to encroach on the rest of the city grid, the former districts shaded as if to erase their existing characteristics. And we see an inspiration for the blight maps here. This is an educational film from 1953 called The Warning Shadow, which used X-ray animations to depict the growth of a small black dysplasia on a man's lung. The film ends with a patient agreeing to a pneumonectomy, or the surgical removal of the lung. An eradication by surgery or radium was the preferred treatment for cancer. So similarly, architects and planners seized on this type of treatment as a model for how blight should be treated in cities. Many municipal departments, aided by private companies like the Rand Corporation, first attempted immunizations, such as increased municipal services, including fire and police stations, and attempts to enforce stricter building codes by neighborhood. But when this failed, they advocated for an urban chemotherapy, the total eradication of clusters of blight. In his book, The City, Its Growth, Its Decay, Its Future, planner E.L.L. Sarnan used a diagram of the disintegration of cells to discuss the disintegration of the fabric of the city, and a healthy cell as a model for rebuilding. Further, he writes, the slum see clears by piecemeal mending, and the old infects the new in short order. The planner must know, as well as the doctor, that when the head aches, the stomach might be out of order. And the planner must be aware of the fact, as well as the doctor, that vitality cannot be transfused into a dead organ. The dead organ must be removed and the transfusion effected in a healthy part of the body. He must unearth the roots of evil. He must amputate slums by a decisive surgery, and he must transfuse vitality only into those areas that are protected against contagion. As they had in the sanitary movement, children were often invoked as innocent victims in order to further the cause. James W. Fallon, who was the commissioner of the Urban Renewal Administration at the time, gave a talk called Slums and Blight, a Disease of Urban Life. And it showed Gussie, which is a cartoon depiction of a waif-like young white girl, as a proxy for what he calls the deadly effect of slums on human lives. She's introduced standing on a pile of rubble or adrift on a sea of blight, as Fallon writes. And the book shows a series of maps overlaying juvenile delinquency, lack of sanitation, tuberculosis, and population density, while concluding that the densest occurrences of all of these illnesses, both physical and for the population, always points to the center of cities. And later, Gussie is shown wielding the gargantuan broom of code enforcement of health and sanitation. And so to address the issue, urban renewal documents from New York City to San Francisco depicted strikingly similar landscapes: sleek, sterile towers on a flat platform of green. San Francisco's Jackson Square plan is shown as isolated from any existing fabric save for City Hall, with no mention of the Fillmore neighborhood as a cultural center for the West Coast small Black population. And indeed, 80% of those removed by urban renewal were Black. In Baltimore, the number was reported to be 100%. The logic of blight as a disease gave justification to the eradication, erasure, and reoccupation of neighborhoods with a quote-unquote healthy graft of green of anonymous towers and landscapes. Which brings us to, what I would say were some of the preoccupations in our pre-pandemic time, but may continue to be, right, as we start to move out of it. And that is the modulation of the environment to control behavior. And many of those movements come as a response to the obesity epidemic. In 2005, obesity was estimated to incur over $190 billion, or almost 21% of all US healthcare expenditures. And researchers started to draw connections between larger patterns of change in society, ranging from food availability to technological attachment. But a great deal of literature started to point to sedentary lifestyles, encouraged by the unabated suburban growth oriented around automobiles as a driver of the obesity epidemic as well. And so this is why by the end of the 20th century, the locus of disease would shift from the cities to the suburbs in the popular imagination. These figures notwithstanding, we do know, of course, that the definition of obesity is still very problematic, from the unreliability of the body mass index, or BMI, which is still often used, and its relationship to overall health or cultural and racial ideals of bodies and diets. Nevertheless, many designers and urban planners saw an opportunity to elevate their practice in the name of public health, but sometimes this actually exacerbated health inequities. However, on a related point, many also pointed out that car-centric design does exacerbate climate change and urban heat islands, which I think in the future is only going to present a larger threat to all of our health. That said, one of the first movements to come out against these decades of suburban growth was probably the New Urbanism movement, which was based on highly specific urban and architectural codes to build neo-traditional neighborhoods, or neighborhoods based on models such as Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities, which are very clearly referenced in their documents. Andres Duany, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg, and Jeff Speck wrote a book called Suburban Nation in 1990, and talking about how much the suburban environment had degraded not just health, but sense of civics and overall sort of malaise of the general population. And some of its generalized observations and principles are very common sense, even admirable in theory. But many times when enacted on the ground, it became almost immediately problematic. In their steadfast belief that the old way of building was best, the authors often emphasized the historical blind spots of building for social change, and even uncritically doubled down. Duany Plater-Zyberg's urban codes were a prescription to the landscape, not just to address obesity, but they also claimed to improve social cohesion, civic participation, with the main move of eliminating cars from the public realm. But alongside that, the early New Urbanists were particularly taken with regional interpretations of European architecture in the Deep South. Duany and Plater-Zyberg have cited that their main inspirations came from a road trip to towns such as Savannah, Charleston, and Natchez, Mississippi. However, they rarely reference, if at all, the racial, social, or class systems that were inherent in these different forms of dwelling. Most of all, some of the failures of New Urbanism came because building to these prescriptive guidelines was very difficult to enact within existing tangles of sprawl, and was instead relegated to being built on greenfields or far from job centers. And so in many cases, sometimes increased sprawl instead. However, the willingness of governments to invest in the supposedly curative effects of New Urbanism became apparent when in the mid-1990s, it was adopted as the standard architectural and planning style of public housing under the Clinton administration's Hope 6 development plans. Hope 6 did attempt to take some lessons learned from the disastrous mid-century modernist public housing developments, proposing a scattered site strategy that would strategically infill often slightly higher income neighborhoods with smaller scale single or multifamily housing. But just as in the mid-century, this tactic of adopting a specific aesthetic for public housing, even if it was neo-traditionalism instead of modernism, still served to visually stigmatize those within, while continuing to imply that those living in it would be uplifted and have their morals corrected through the architecture. And again, while it was largely a failure in administration and maintenance rather than design, the well-documented effects of displacement wrought by the Hope 6 program, as old high-density units were turned on to build new but less numerous mid-scale ones, ended up being also detrimental to residents' health. Nevertheless, the built environment is still widely viewed as a treatment for the obesity epidemic, extending from the figurative prescription of New Urbanism to now literally being described by the US Surgeon General, as we can see in this 2015 Step It Up campaign. To provide an environment that supports walking, that supports active transportation is definitely positive, but it's going to take a lot more to untangle our car-centric environments, especially as we think about equity issues. As cities and walkable environments have become more in demand, ostensibly healthier and greener neighborhoods have also become less affordable. And while we look at that, we also need to interrogate the idea that at the same time, the design, planning, and even public health community denigrates the suburb as an unhealthy environment is also a time when many of them are becoming more racially and economically heterogeneous, a far cry from the kind of suburbs that were described 30 years ago in Suburban Nation. Moreover, there needs to be a rethinking of the idea in the United States that where we live is a free choice, or that it always reflects one's moral fortitude or choices about their health. But this is in line with a country that usually conflates wellness with personal responsibility. So, some kind of half-formed thoughts about COVID-19, especially as it seems like we're turning another corner. I can't say post-pandemic. Yeah, I just can't bring myself to say post-pandemic yet, lest I curse all of us. But, looking at the past 2 years, I think it seems like we've seen a century pass by, especially in terms of medical history. We do know this, that the built environment provides opportunities for, but it also provides risks to our health. Our conception of healthy places changes with medical knowledge and different pandemics. But also we need to watch out for when healthy places are only for people that can afford them. And all the fears of past epidemics have been made urgent again with COVID-19. We know now that it is an airborne disease. So many of those early interventions around miasmic diseases have actually proven to be relevant. But we also all remember how early in the pandemic we were sanitizing our surfaces or even our groceries and our mail. We changed our behavior. We changed spaces to socially distance and quarantine. But we can also see many of the ways that past epidemics were addressed in the urban environment are consistent to today's pandemic. We know that green space is essential, sanitation is key, and the design of where we live, it has a large effect on our health. So I don't think, and we've already seen many of these dissipate, I don't think this is going to be, any of these design interventions are going to be the lasting legacy of COVID-19. However, what can we take in mind going forward, especially when it comes to equity, and what can we remember from these past epidemics? In this cartoon from Puck magazine, cholera was conflated with newcomers. The title of the piece, called "The Kind of Assisted Immigrant We Cannot Afford to Admit." Cholera is depicted as a skeleton in vaguely Middle Eastern clothing. And this has echoes, of course, of the attacks on Asian American populations early in the pandemic and that are still happening today. Over time, instead of taking consideration of certain populations as vulnerable to disease, often they have been blamed for spreading contagion instead. And many of these environments have been built as a way to systematically remove and quarantine them, whether it is physically or economically. Or populations have been subjected to architectural experiments that are built on narratives and metaphor rather than epidemiology or backed by social safety nets. And health has been used very explicitly to exclude populations. A 1922 housing covenant for Silver Spring, Maryland read that for the purposes of sanitation and health, no owner will sell or lease the said land of anyone of a race whose death rate is at a higher percentage than the white race. Germ theory and the language of quarantine was extensively used in Baltimore's residential segregation ordinance of 1910, which kept Blacks from moving onto blocks that had white majority of residents, even when a series of coordinated actions by the city beforehand had excluded Blacks from healthcare access and neighborhood improvements in the first place. In San Francisco's Chinatown, disease was used as a justification for the Department of Public Health to repeatedly raid and control the neighborhood's boundaries. And medical inspections and largely fabricated assessments on Angel Island were also used to keep Chinese out of San Francisco altogether. So let us consider how health has been used to exclude these groups from desirable landscapes or further conscribe them to landscapes of risk. Recent studies from University of California and other places have argued that we need to reckon with how our social practices or our legal practices, land use practices, actually do have long-lasting physiological effects. By overlaying mortgage companies' redlining maps with health data, researchers have found that not only are these neighborhoods still largely occupied by Black populations and immigrant populations, but there remains a plethora of environmental hazards from air pollution to high lead content in the soil, resulting in many disparities in health, most notably asthma. And we should also remember that even one of our most celebrated healthy landscapes, Central Park, was designed by a revered landscape architect, abolitionist, and former public health officer, was built on the ruins of Seneca Village, a thriving African-American village that was nonetheless written up as a squatter's camp in the popular press and referred to as such by Olmsted himself, to give the image that it was squalid and pestilent, even though it was a thriving village occupied by homeowners, churches, and Black-owned businesses. And so as we go forward and we think about the real effects of COVID-19 on the built environment, instead of thinking about decontamination rooms or plexiglass desks, can we ask ourselves about the conditions that cause urban heat islands and air pollution disproportionately in communities of color that have also now proven to be underlying causes of COVID mortality? To conclude, the environment doesn't cause or cure disease, but we do know that it is a key factor in either providing these opportunities for health or creating the risk of debilitating illness. The landscapes we inhabit embed themselves in our bones and organs over time. Some pathways are known and some are not, and we should keep exploring those. In her essay, Shifting Sites, landscape architect Christina Hill discussed how in culture and ecological science, we have long viewed our skins as boundaries between us and the natural world, but rather our skin is permeable to energy, to materials, to organisms. And as we now know, the burdens of an inequitable social system, accumulating illness, but also resiliency over generations. So I think as we hopefully come out of this crisis now, but perhaps understand and realize that there are others ahead of us, hopefully we can take what we've learned from history and shape a healthier future for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. That was a fantastic presentation. I would love to open it up to anyone that has questions or comments. I have a lot to say, but I don't want to steal.
When were you in New Orleans? We'll start with this. When were you in New Orleans, Lindsay?
Actually, around the same time you were. I started as an architecture student at Tulane in 2003, 2004, and then so I also was impacted by Hurricane Katrina, but came back to finish my last year there in 2007. So yeah. Kazuya, did you want to ask Sarah a question? Oh, maybe not. Well, I think there were a few points from your presentation that really struck out to me as someone who actually has a background in public health and is now doing an urban planning degree. Some of the information you shared about actually how newer cities on the West Coast were marketing themselves, and actually through large populations who were hoping to alleviate existing health concerns. Was actually something I didn't know that much about. So that was really fascinating to me, that was actually sort of a marketing pitch. And I'm really happy that sort of where you ended up coming around to at the end, and just about how good health intentions, even throughout the history, can really be quite problematic. And I think it's certainly true now as much as ever, from someone who's involved in a research project around new urbanist type zoning and physical activity. I think it's a really important point. And a lot of my dissertation research is very much interested in this idea of better health for whom, and do these sort of zoning strategies have the potential to cause gentrification and displacement. So I'd actually love to talk to you more about that.
I would love to too. Yeah, let's have a longer talk. I would love to hear more about your research, because I think it's complicated, right? Like I said, the principles of new urbanism are obviously great. We should have more active transportation introduced in cities. Is just how, right? Like, and it's not the design itself that causes gentrification. It's so many other factors that need to be addressed at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else present want to chime in and ask any questions or have any comments? Yeah, Allison, go for it.
Hey, thank you so much. That was really, really, really informative. Just a very quick question. Wondering if all these amazing images that you showed in your presentation, are they in your book?
Several of them are. Yes, it was, it had to be, so the process of doing a book, I learned a lot, this is my first book, I learned a lot in the process of doing it. If nothing else, the question of image rights, right? Like what you have to buy. And but public domain images were a large help in illustrating the book. So, and it was helpful for me because, you know, as I said, as I was trying to construct these histories, I was looking at a lot of public domain materials, such as sanitary surveys that were done. Government documents were very helpful in thinking about like how governments conceived of urban blight at the time as well. And so that's why I think that the illustrations actually rely fairly heavily on that, because I think it's important to see you know, how disease and built environment were conceived of in popular thought. So yes, but there are more images here. I had to cut down the images, like sadly, by a lot when it came down to it.
Oh, no, thank you. I appreciate it. And like, I just honestly thinking self-serving for my teaching purposes, I really, really, really like love to use, you know, these kind of images, ones that are getting folks thinking. I think it's such an important teaching tool. So it's just like, oh, if I buy your book, can I see?
No, I'm happy to share the slideshow with you as well. I feel like
awesome.
Yeah, just go ahead and email me after this.
Yeah, thank you.
Share with you. You know, I think, again, just as my training from as an architect and a designer, I start all lectures with images. It's really, and actually when I was writing the book, I had to start a file of images because I was trying to, you know, trace this history over time. So it is very important to me. It was very difficult to cut images when it came down to it for you know, for the book. Sure.
Kurt?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I really enjoyed your presentation and the images and the connection with cancer and blight and really displaying it in such an interesting way. And I wonder, you know, there could be an argument that, you know, the ways in which addressing health concerns, that the solution becomes, you know, the problem in exacerbating inequity in particular. Mm-hmm. And I think some of the stories you've told help us understand that a bit. I'm wondering if you also looked at the role of professions in doing this and the sort of professional interests of professions, because if we were to take a look at the social history of medicine, for example, the mm-hmm. role of physicians creating their power, maintaining their power was very much a part of what the current healthcare system looks like. Right. And, you know, whether it was about consciously creating an inequitable healthcare system, you know, it was certainly about enhancing the power of physicians and, you know, quite successful for many years at doing that. And so I'm just wondering if you had, you know, had thoughts about the roles of various professions, including planners and architects, and self-servingness and its potential impact in generating inequity.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. And it is something I actually get into in a little bit more detail in the book itself, talking about the rise of professionalizations of physicians. I think what's interesting, you know, as I learned from Jason Corburn, who was one of my mentors at Berkeley, which is, you know, it's interesting that the professionalization of the planning profession, public health, and public health are related, right? It came up at about the same time. And to address these major health crises in the cities, they were forced to come together, right? And they were looking at all aspects of the environment. But the schism that we normally, when we normally talk about the schism between built environment or planning and public health, was also a schism between medicine and public health, right, as practices. And we see, not just an increasing sort of disparagement of public health from physicians, or any public health initiative being sort of decried as communism, so it becomes political as well, right? And that's another sort of denigration of the profession. But and now I'm on the spot, the name escapes me. There was a book written in the 1920s called The New Public Health, and it decries people that were looking, it was decries miasmists, right? And they were like, they will look for any excuse except germs to talk about public health, right? And it's very snide. He says they're looking at dirty laundry, they're looking at puddles, they're looking at all these sources as denigratory to our health, and we need to be thinking about medicine, we need to be thinking about vaccines, right? And I think that also sort of that's also an example, right, of these schisms that started to happen, and everybody was kind of addressing health in their own ways, where it was, more metaphorical in terms of the planners, or more directly in terms of the doctors, and then public health just always struggling with sort of like funding and public buy-in, right? Because when public health works, it's invisible. And when it doesn't work, then it's a crisis, as we've seen in the past 2 years. I am really hopeful that, it was interesting, pre-COVID, when we were having this discussion around walkable neighborhoods in particular, we were starting to see some of those alliances again from the American Institute of Architects, right? APA also starting to be interested, a professional interest in health again. I'm surprised there hasn't been sort of more interest post-COVID, right? Can we rethink, say, engineering standards and health, with this sort of like siloing of whose responsibility is health, right? And is it a public health issue, is it a medical issue? I think continues to just stymie a lot of these efforts, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Or the joint call for healthy communities. I was going to say that was a sort of a major step too, right? And trying to bring the professions together. But I think with COVID and people, still not really reconciling themselves with, I think, the limits of individual choice. That is, vaccines, masks, however you want to look at it, and not. I think we still hasn't been a large push to thinking about, we do need environmental interventions, right, to prevent the next pandemic, and if nothing else, to think about how we mitigate the effects of climate change, or even start to decarbonize our future as well, which is also a health issue.
Yeah, cannot agree more on that last point. So we have a question from Rodrigo in our chat box. So he asked, in your opinion, do you think, or could new urbanism solve problems of equity? To what extent can design solve social problems?
Yeah, so I only, I bring up new urbanism in the book just because I think it depends how you see new urbanism too, right? Is new urbanism just the principle of introducing active transportation and walkability and maybe getting rid of cars in the city? Or is it a very form-driven, right, very prescriptive way of building buildings? And I think depending on who you ask or what adherents, of new urbanism you would ask, they would come up with different answers, right? So yes, I think, putting active transportation back in cities, providing more public transit, providing a public realm is one way to address equity. I would say design cannot solve social problems significantly. I think, as I mentioned in the talk a few times, it's a major factor, right? And it can be supportive or detrimental. But a lot of design around health has to come around an ethic, I think, of maintenance. It has to come around an ethic of care. It has to come in line with public engagement, because health issues are very different depending on what locality you're looking at. You know, some people may want to ban cars from a neighborhood. Some people just want sort of basic safety measures and make sure they can cross the street safely, right? Or have it be maintained. So as a designer myself, right, I still believe in like the power of parks or well-designed streets and stuff, but it has to come hand in hand with the people that are experiencing those environments, and policy as well. Hope that's not too wishy-washy for you, but it's complicated. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we're just about out of time. So I just, Sara, want to thank you again so much for a wonderful presentation and conversation today. Before everyone jumps off the call, just I wanted to do a quick shout out for our next CUPS Friday Forum, which is planned for April 15th. I'm actually going to be presenting on that one. And it's a nice follow-up to this one because we're actually talking about the relationship between zoning, land use, and physical activity, and to present on some research that has been done and is currently being followed up with in the UIC School of Public Health. So I hope everyone can join for that, and please keep an eye out for upcoming announcements in the weeks ahead. And thank you all so much. Have a wonderful Friday and weekend. Sara, maybe you and I can stay on for just another minute or two and chat really quickly.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.